All our programming right now is virtual, though I do want to tell you that the library is open by appointment only. So if you'd like some more information on that, just check out our website. And we are also offering curbside pickup. And there's also information about that on our website. For those maybe joining us for the first time tonight, we are coming to you on the library Zoom webinar platform. So you are automatically muted from home and we don't see your videos, you'll just see us. And in addition to that, you'll be able to do questions. At the bottom, there's a Q&A. You can type in your questions. And our presenter tonight has said you can actually type them in as we go along. We may not do them exactly when we go along, but we definitely will have time for questions at the end of the program. So tonight, as I said at the beginning, if you heard, we are going back in time to 1970, actually 50 years ago. I'm very pleased to have with us a first-time presenter, which I always like someone new. With us tonight is award-winning journalist, speaker, and author Evan Weiner. He has appeared on numerous national radio and television programs and has published over 6 books on the business and politics of sports. So I'd like you to sit back, relax. As we go back in time, I give you Evan Weiner.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you for inviting me to the Bernard's Library, and thank all of you for showing up tonight. I'm going to do a little introduction of me because more than likely none of you have seen me before, or maybe 1 or 2 have. My name is Evan Weiner. I have been doing this type of thing since I'm 15 years old, although if you ask my parents, they probably said I started doing this when I was 2 years old, carrying a can around, talking into it. In 1971, I was at Spring Valley High School in Muncie, New York, in Rockland County, and I was in 11th grade. This is September of 1971, and I had a teacher by the name of Joe Dionisio, who never knew my name, and to this day probably doesn't know my name, even though prior to the COVID outbreak, I would see him and the old teachers up in Mahwah at the State Line Diner, and I always thank Joe because Joe opened the doors for me. He said, student, that's what he called everybody. Student, you have a good voice. How would you like to be on radio? Yeah, I want to be on radio the worst way, the worst way, the worst way. And I was. I was with WRKL Radio on a show called Tiger Talk. 15-minute show every Tuesday afternoon at 3:45. 1,000-watt radio station, which probably did get into your air, 910 on the dial. So probably 910 if you hear Polish programming today at 910 on your AM dial. That's the station I was on back in 1971. Joe also opened the door for me at the Nyack Journal News and at the Bergen Record. I was what was called a stringer, and whatever happened in Spring Valley, I would send it to the Nyack Journal News or down to the Bergen Record in Hackensack. I did 3 stints at the Bergen Record, 71 to 73 while I was in high school, 79 and 80, and also in the 2000s, Peter Grad hired me to do op-ed pieces on occasion for the Bergen Record, so I had 3 stints there. Fast forward to 1978, I graduated college in 77. I was a year ahead, I was 21 years old. And I was hired at a 500-watt radio station, WGRC. That's in Nanuet, New York, also in Rockland County. And Steve North, whose father was the stage manager for Walter Cronkite in the 1960s. Steve was the news director. And Steve said, you got to work on Saturdays. That wasn't a problem. You used to work on Saturdays, but your work would be heard on Monday. So there was no news on Sunday, unless there was something extraordinary that happened. But 2 of my first assignments were at Rockland Community College, and I interviewed Ralph Nader and Julian Bond, who was the first African-American state senator from the state of Georgia. We are in March of 1978. I'm still 21 years old. And Steve said the New York State Democrats are having a fundraiser over at the Nyack Townhouse on Saturday in the afternoon. Why don't you go there and don't worry about filing anything because we're not going to use it until Monday unless something extraordinary happens. So I go down to the Nyack Townhouse, which is now a senior's home. And it's actually, it was the Nyack, it was Tappan Manor. That's what it was called in those days. And anyway, I get there and I see one guy walk in. He's an obscure assemblyman from Manhattan. I don't know if you ever heard of him. You might have Jerome Nadler. I don't know if you ever heard of Jerome Nadler. Also walking in, Hugh Carey, who is running for governor of the state of New York. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was in his second year as the senator from the state of New York. And then Mario Cuomo, he was running for lieutenant governor, and he brings with him a couple of his kids. The teenager, Andrew Cuomo, who was 2 years younger than me at the time. I was 21, he was 19. And this little 9-year-old kid that's running around, Chris Cuomo. Matilda was there as well. And Hugh Carey, running for governor, was there. And then this tall guy walks in, really tall, handsome guy he's got this blondish, grayish hair, movie star looks, and he walks right to me, looks at me, says, "I like you." He never met me. I never met him, but I knew who he was because I watched Batman. He was the mayor of Gotham City, John Lindsay. And John Lindsay said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Okay, what do you want to tell me?" He said, "I'm running for Senate, state of New York, 1980. My work is done for the day. Nothing is going to top that." So I get him to tell that into my tape recorder, made sure the tape was there, run to my radio station, file it immediately with the radio station. We beat our competition, which was WRKL, where I started. And file it with AP, the Associated Press, Marlene Egg, file it with Randy Burlage from United Press International, goes out in the wires. I get a call from WNEW Radio in New York. And it's Henry Marcotte. And he said to me, "We like that story." I said, "How much are you going to pay me?" "It's $10. I said, "Sold." And with that, I started 3.5 years doing some work for WNEW at the age of 21. And I don't know how many of you remember William B. Williams, but William B. Williams was over there, and on the FM side was Scott Muni and Richard Neer and Andy Fisher, who was doing the news over there, who was one of my mentors, along with Sam Hall over there. 1970, May 4th, 1970. That's Marianne Vecchio, and she's a runaway. She's 14 years old, and she somehow ends up at Kent State University. She ran away from her home in Florida, and this is the iconic picture from 1970. She's crying out for help. There is somebody who's dying right there after being shot by the Ohio National Guard. It's Kent State. 50 years ago, and almost 3 months now, or 2 months now. That picture is emblematic of 1970 and all of the problems in 1970, but it wasn't the only thing that happened in 1970. 1970 was beginning of Richard Nixon's second year in office, and he has to deal with a whole bunch of things, including protests. My daughter lives in Seattle, and she doesn't live very far. In fact, she lives to the left of this picture. This is a picture of Seattle, of the highway, with the protesters who blocked traffic and the Seattle police of anti-Vietnam demonstration. And there is Richard Nixon. And I got to know him in 1985. In 1985, Major League Baseball owners and the Major League Baseball umpires were at an impasse in their negotiations for a new collective bargaining agreement. And Richie Phillips was the head of the umpires union. He lived in Philadelphia, and he happened to live next door to Julie and David Eisenhower. And Richie would see Dick Nixon, as he called him, every weekend, because he would drive down from Park Ridge with Pat, and they would babysit for Julie and David's children. He was there. And so Richie is having problems with the negotiations, and he tells Peter Ueberroth, the baseball commissioner, "Hey, how about if we go to arbitration?" And Ueberroth says, "Who do you got in mind?" He says, "Dick Nixon." "Dick Nixon?" "Yeah, Dick Nixon." He said, "Sure, why not?" And with that, I got to deal with Nixon in 1985, 1986, 1987. And it was through the baseball umpires dispute that Richard Nixon would return to the mainstream, so to speak, and become a senior statesman at that point. It wasn't the David Frost interviews. It was Nixon with the Major League Baseball Umpires Association. Here he is. This is May of 1970. He's meeting with the protesters in Washington. The Vietnam War, of course, is going on. This war starts literally in August of 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So it's coming up to 6 years. By May of 1970, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave Lyndon Johnson the right to do whatever he wanted to do to quell the expansionism of North Vietnam and to make sure South Vietnam didn't fall to communists or to the communists, along with Cambodia, along with Laos, along with Thailand. So we're there, the United States, year number 6. The calendar did flip to 1970, but the problems from 1967, the Summer of Love, 1968, which was the most dysfunctional year of the swinging 60s in the United States with the assassinations of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy, Johnson not running for re-election, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago and the rioting there, all dysfunction, Nixon becoming president in November of 1968, and all the problems in 1969. None of that disappears, except for one thing. Vietnam War is still raging, but the war in Biafra, which started in 1967 between the new nation of Biafra and Nigeria, the Biafrans broke away from Nigeria, would end on January 15, 1970. The Middle East remains a powder keg, but this time it's not Israel that's involved, it's Jordan that's involved. The Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States continues. The Cold War between the Soviet Union and China continues, or Red China or Communist China, as it was back in those days. The Soviets were thinking of nuking Red China or Communist China in 1969 because of border skirmishes, and that went back to 1960. Racial divisions remain in America. Biafra. Now, some of you probably remember this from the CARE commercials that used to be on TV. Send us some money and we'll make sure the starving children in Biafra get food. The War of Biafra started in July of 1967, July 6, 1967, and would end on January 15, 1970. Biafra, that represented nationalist aspirations of the Biafran people. The Biafrans felt that they could no longer coexist with the northern-dominated federal government of Nigeria. And they got some help, at least they got some help in name from some countries. But by 1968, Nigerian troops surrounded Biafra, capturing coastal oil facilities in the city of Port Harcourt. They were helped out by the Brits. The Brits were allies of Nigeria, and Lyndon Johnson didn't think it was worthwhile for the United States to get involved with whatever was going on in Nigeria with Biafra. There was a war for 2.5 years, about 100,000 military casualties. 500,000 to 2 million Biafrans were said to have died of starvation. And that is the flag of the very short-lived Biafra. It lasted about 2.5 years. 2 million Biafran civilians could have died from starvation. That was all caused by the naval blockade by the Nigerian and British governments. Biafran forces would surrender to the Nigerian federal military government, and that war would end on January 15, 1970. There's still some pockets of resistance. 50 years later, some Biafrans do want to break away. This was a nuclear proliferation treaty that was signed in 1970 to limit the spread of nuclear arms. That was in March of 1970, ratified in the United Nations. And the basic purpose was to prevent the spread and creation of nuclear weapons, to work towards complete disarmament, that of course has never happened, and for nations to cooperate with each other in safe development of nuclear energy. Vietnam. Vietnam continues and continues and continues. It's a quagmire. Now, Walter Cronkite, 1968, February 1968, February 27, 1968, did the CBS reports on Vietnam, where he concluded that the best the United States could do in this war would be a stalemate. That was it. But this thing is going on, and the demonstrations go on and on. September 7th, 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and that authorized Lyndon Johnson to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States to prevent further aggression by the communist government of North Vietnam. Came on the heels of an alleged attack on 2 U.S. naval destroyers stationed off the coast of North Vietnam, and that would start the war, full-scale war. Vietnam had been a problem since the mid-50s. France got out of there. It split into two, the communist North and the South, and the Civil War would start, and America decided to take sides. In November 3rd of 1969, Richard Nixon gave his talk, the Great Silent Majority talk, where he names the silent majority, and he declares the war protesters as the enemy. The term popularized November 3rd, 1969 in the speech where he said, and so to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. What support? Support the troops in Vietnam. Didn't go down well with the people who were against him. November 15th, there was the moratorium in Washington in the march, which drew 2 million people to the mall, and Nixon saw it, obviously, looking out, and said he wouldn't be deterred by 2 million protesters. A Nixon administration official clarified Nixon's concept of silent majority as a large and normally undemonstrative cross-section of the country that until last night, which was November 3rd, 1969, refrained from articulating its opinions on the war. Nixon referred to the vast majority of Americans who did not take part in the mass demonstrations against the Vietnam War, nor participated in the counterculture. Now, counterculture was a huge word back in those days, if you remember, but nobody's ever successfully defined what the counterculture was. Allegedly hippies, but hippies were gone by 1967, officially. It was a word that was out there, just used, and it had some context, but it had no real meaning. But anyway, in the counterculture and public discourse in the country, those were not only the older generation, the World War II veterans who were about 50, 52 years old at that point, but also the young in the West, in the Midwest, in the South, many of whom would eventually serve in Vietnam. There were pro-Vietnam protesters, such as the Reverend Carl McIntyre with his wife, Ferry, April 4th, 1970. They marched on the mall in front of the Capitol building, supporting the troops in Vietnam and doing some other protests as well, Bible in school and a whole bunch of other things, prayer and Bible in school. With the Bible in hand, the Reverend Carl McIntyre, his wife, Ferry McIntyre, lead the March for Victory on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, April 4th, 1970, on the second anniversary of the killing of Martin Luther King. McIntyre said his parade was a demonstration for military victory in Vietnam, and along the way picked up assorted characters that gave talks, including the segregationist Lester Maddox from Georgia, who would be the Georgia governor eventually. He was a restaurant owner, and he said, just in case some of you communists, socialists, and other integrationists have any doubt, the Pick Rick, that was his chicken place, the Pick Rick will never be integrated. If you want some fried chicken, it'll have to be something other than the Pick Rick chicken. And also in 1970, as all of this is going on, there's a guy by the name of Norman Lear. And Norman Lear is trying to sell a British television show that he got the rights to in America. And it's going to be called All in the Family. And in 1970, CBS picks up the option to start All in the Family in January of 1971. Now, Lear had pitched it to ABC in 1968 and also to CBS in 1968, but finally gets the commitment in 1970. So as everything is going on around the United States, Norman Lear is able to watch what's going on. The silent majority, he's got the character for the silent majority in Archie Bunker, who would make his first appearance in January of 1971, but he is being created with everything else going on in the United States. And there is the famous scene where Sammy Davis Jr. is on the show and he kisses Archie, saying, "Archie, you're the whitest man I've ever met in my life." Many, and I bring up Archie here because this is what the Nixon people said, many Americans, particularly working class and middle class whites, responded to the turbulence of the late 1960s, the urban riots, the anti-war protests, the alienating counterculture, there's that word again, by embracing a new kind of conservative populism. Sick of what they interpreted as spoiled hippies and whining protesters tired of interfering government that, in their view, coddled poor people and black people at taxpayers' expense, these individuals formed what the political strategists called silent majority. These were Nixon's people who came up with this policy. The Vietnam War, support the boys in Vietnam. And I always say the boys, and I'm reminded of somebody who came to my 1968 talk about 2-3 years ago and said to me, she was a woman, she said, there were also girls in Vietnam. They may not have been in the front line, but they were helping out, whether they were nurses or clerical in whatever buildings that they were working in. There were 500,000 troops. Some of them were women, and that is true. There were some women in Vietnam. On April 20th, Richard Nixon announced that he would be withdrawing 100,000 troops from Vietnam by the end of the year. 2 weeks later, the United States invaded Cambodia, and that is when things changed on a dime. It extended the war and seemingly precluded any further withdrawals. And there he is. Oh, that's Cambodia over there. And that's South Vietnam. And there's Laos and there's Thailand. Nixon explaining why there was military action in Cambodia. The Cambodian invasion, and some of you probably might have remembered it. Some of you might have been of the age that could serve in the military. I was born in 1956, so I was 14 years old at that point. So I wasn't going to serve, at least then. I had 4 years to go. The Cambodian invasion was a series of military operations conducted in eastern Cambodia during 1970. The invasion's a policy of Richard Nixon and his armed forces. 13 major operations conducted by the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, between April 29th and July 22nd. And the U.S. forces got in on May 1st and would leave on June 30th. And college campuses erupted, absolutely erupted. And that is Kent State. I have a friend who was at Kent State that day, Steve Albert, who was one of the Albert brothers, the broadcasting crew, Marv Albert, Al Albert, and Steve. And Steve was on the campus in 1970, and tried to talk to him about it, and he really wouldn't say anything. It's the Ohio National Guard. It's a common area. James Rhodes, the governor of Ohio, decides that he hears or gets word that there are going to be some armed confrontations possible at Kent State, so he sends in the Ohio National Guard. The shootings take place May 4th, 1970. Members of the Ohio National Guard shot at unarmed college students during a mass protest against the bombing of Cambodia by the United States Air Force. 28 guardsmen fired approximately 67 rounds into the crowd. That took place 13 seconds. 4 students killed, 9 wounded, one of whom suffered permanent paralysis. Some of the students who were shot were protesting against the Cambodian campaign, which Nixon had announced 5 days earlier. Other students who were shot just had been walking near the common area and just watching the protest from a distance. And that is the Pulitzer Prize winning picture of Marianne Vecchio. And it was not taken by a professional photographer. It was taken by a Kent State student who took that picture, and that picture is an award-winning picture. And Marianne Vecchio still goes back to Kent State and gives addresses, even though she was a runaway from Florida at that point, 14 years old, about May 4th, 1970. Now, there is a mistaken notion that this was the only place that violence broke out on a college campus where people were killed. Not true. Many students at Kent State were ready to launch an all-out attack on the National Guard. Faculty members, and they were led by Glenn Frank, pleaded with the students to leave the common area. They wouldn't leave. It took 20 minutes for medical people to get to the wounded and the dead students. After 20 minutes of speaking, the students left. The ambulance personnel was able to get to the wounded, and the guard would leave the area. The guard would be brought up on some charges eventually, and everything would be dismissed. The shootings led to protests on college campuses. Some of you, I can't see any pictures of you, but whenever I give this talk, there are inevitably some people who are now 68 to 72, 73 years old who were on campuses that shut down in 1970, never took tests, and basically closed down their campuses. There was student strikes. 450 campuses across the country closed. There were violent and non-violent demonstrations on many college campuses. That's Buffalo, New York. That's the police in Buffalo, because there is a demonstration going up Main Street, and it wasn't just college students. It was high school students, people in 12th grade, people in 11th grade, people in 10th grade, because if you were a senior, you were facing Vietnam. If you were a junior, you were a year away. If you were a sophomore, you were 2 years away. I was in 9th grade. I was a year ahead, so I would have been 4 years away. But there were the cops waiting for the protesters. And there were skirmishes in Buffalo. Thousands marched down Main Street in Buffalo protesting the Cambodian invasion. High school students, worried about their future, joined in. Club-swinging Buffalo police fired tear gas. Rocks were hurled through the bank windows on Main Street. Students repeatedly gasped with tear gas. On May 7th, police went to Buffalo, University of Buffalo, and there was a demonstration at the student union. So they went into the student union, fired tear gas, and shot. 4 students are wounded. And that is the University of New Mexico. And this is some faulty information which has the New Mexico National Guard complete with their bayonets going after college demonstrators, unarmed college demonstrators, I'll add. Take a look at those pants. I think I had pants like that. That guy on the right side, look at those pants. Wow, 1970 fashions. On May 8th, 11 students were bayoneted at the University of New Mexico by the New Mexico National Guard. There was a confrontation with the protesters. The governor, David Cargo, called in the New Mexico National Guard because he was given some false information by the New Mexico State Police that they claimed protesters were armed and dangerous. When they did the evaluation of what happened, not one student was armed. And that is Lower Manhattan. That is Federal Hall, Lower Manhattan. And that is a demonstration organized by Peter Brennan, who eventually would be in the Nixon cabinet. Now, the guy with the WMCA microphone, I like that picture. Remember WMCA? They were the good guys. D. Mitchell Reed and Jack Spector and Harry Harrison and Dandy Dan Daniel and a few others. The only one I knew out of that was Dean Anthony. Anyway, WINS, WMCA, which was a top 40 music station, actually had a news department and actually went out and covered this demonstration. It was the hard hat demonstration in May of 1970. Impeach the Red Mayor. Hey, that Red Mayor had something to do with me being on WNEW at the age of 21, the Red Mayor being John Lindsay. And if you notice, there is a little kid right in front. There actually is more than one. There are a couple of little kids right in front, which means that this riot could seriously injure some children. It was May 8th, the anti-war protest at Federal Hall, right by Wall Street, partially in reaction to the Kent State killings. And then there was the counter rally of pro-Nixon construction workers organized by Peter J. Brennan, who had later become the U.S. Labor Secretary under Nixon, and it was called the Hard Hat Riot down in Lower Manhattan. And there is Nixon. And there he is. Nixon is about ready to go off the wall. Nixon is already under strain. Now, if you remember, November 15th, 1969, 2 million people are in Washington. And Nixon acknowledges the fact that there were 2 million people protesting his Vietnam policy. But he says in November 15th, 1969, he will not waver, that the 2 million people aren't going to have any influence on them. He lied. There was a contentious news conference on on May 8th on Friday night at 10 p.m. Well, it was in prime time in the Pacific Coast, 7 o'clock. And he has the news conference. He's peppered with questions about what happened in Cambodia. What does this mean to Vietnam? He gets done with the news conference, stays up to about 2:15, makes some phone calls, and goes to sleep. Wakes up, puts on some classical music, Rachmaninoff, and then he looks out the window and he sees the crowd gathering on the mall because on May 9th, there is going to be a huge anti-war, which means anti-Nixon demonstration right in front of the White House. So he's trying to figure out what to do. He comes up with a plan. He would take his valet, a Cuban immigrant named Manolo Sanchez, and he would bring him to the Lincoln Memorial at about 4 in the morning or 5 in the morning, because Sanchez had never seen the lights on the Lincoln Memorial. That was the cover. I'm taking him there. I'm going to take him there because he's never seen anything like this. And there it is. That's what Sanchez was supposed to see. Lincoln bathed in light and Lincoln. So he wants to show Sanchez what the monument looked like at night, which I find hard to believe because it gets dark in Washington in December and January, 5:15 in the afternoon. But there was really another reason he decided to go there. It wasn't necessarily trying to impress Manolo, although that would be a cover. He wanted to talk to the anti-war protesters. So he tells the Secret Service about 4:35 in the morning, oh, we're out of here. And the small party left the barricaded White House around 4:35 in darkness. And they see the Lincoln Memorial all lit up. But that wasn't really what he wanted to do. Now, remember, Dick Nixon was a smart guy. He was the #1 student in Duke Law School, where he graduated. He was the valedictorian of the Duke Law School in the 1940s. Nixon decides, you know what, there are a bunch of these ragtag college students around. I'm going to go talk to them. And he does. Which doesn't make the Secret Service too happy. First of all, Secret Service isn't happy that he left to go see the Lincoln Memorial. And then he's going to start talking to the students. And they're not prepared for this. They have no idea because they didn't set up any security for him. One thing about Nixon, and when I knew him in 85, 86, 87, he didn't have any Secret Service protection. He had no bodyguard. You could approach him on the street. He was fine with that. He liked to give out autographs. Afterwards, I'll tell you a story about an autograph. So Nixon tried to get some dialogue started. He started with small talk with the ones. To get the conversation going, I asked how old they were, what were they studying, and the usual questions. Several of them said they attended Syracuse University. And Nixon's reply, got a good football team. There was an interview with one of the students that appeared in the Washington Post. And the guy said, I hope it was because he was tired, because most of what he was saying was absurd. Here we had come from a university that's completely uptight, on strike. And we told him where we were from. He talked about the football team. And when someone said he was from California, he talked about surfing. Remember, Nixon's library is in Yorba Linda. I can't picture Nixon hanging 10. I don't know about you, but can you picture Nixon on a surfboard? I never did that. I can't, but he talked about surfing. And there was the crowd later that day, impeached Nixon, and Nixon and the Fourth Reich, and Nixon could see all this from the White House. The rambling dialogue that morning with the students ranged from travel and marriage to race relations and pollution. Remember, Nixon was the guy who signed the EPA, the Environmental Protection Administration or agency, into law. He founded it. But eventually Nixon got around to his primary purpose, which was to explain his recent actions in Vietnam. And he said it was motivated a desire for peace. I tried to explain to them in the press conference that my goals in Vietnam were the same as theirs. Stop the killing, to end the war, bring peace. Our goal was not to get into Cambodia, but what we were doing, get out of Vietnam. There seemed to be no, they didn't respond. I hope that their hatred of war, which I can well understand, would not turn into a bitter hatred of the whole system, our country and everything it stood for. I said, I know you that most probably think of me as an SOB, but I want you to know that I understand just how you feel. Not sure about that. They didn't understand it, but anyway, he's done with the students and decides to go with Sanchez to the Capitol building. He's going to give Manlolo a personal tour. So he tells the Secret Service we're going to the Capitol building, which thrilled them to no end because they have to set up security there. And it's closed, but he's Richard Nixon, so he can walk in. And he walks through the nearly deserted building, and he becomes the tour guide. And he points out the sights in the chamber to Sanchez. This is this, this is that. And then they get into the chamber, and Nixon goes to his old seat, and he tells Manlolo, go up to the platform and deliver a speech. He does. Nixon gets hungry. He wants breakfast, and he remembers that the congressional lunchroom and breakfast hall is a great place to get hash browns. So that's what he wants. He wants to get hash browns. He hadn't had them since he became president on January 20th, 1969. And they had a famous hash browns dinner. And he goes there, the Secret Service go there, and they find out it's closed. So they have to go down to the Mayflower Hotel to have breakfast. And Nixon goes back to the White House, and he meets with H.R. Haldeman, and he meets with Henry Kissinger, and Haldeman, who is his chief of staff, and there is H.R. Haldeman. He's got his diary, and he writes in his diary hours after the Lincoln visit, I'm concerned about his condition. And he notes that Nixon's behavior that morning constituted the weirdest day so far. I told you Kent State wasn't the only place where there were casualties. A lot of people forget about Jackson State, traditional black school in Mississippi. It's a heritage school. And there was a riot at Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. Long live the spirit of Kent State and Jackson State, the May 4th Coalition. May 15th, Jackson City and Mississippi State Police killed 2 and wound 12 at Jackson State College, which is now Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. So here you now have 6 casualties, 23 plus 9, 32 wounded on their body counts. There are body counts on college campuses, and Nixon is getting very concerned about what's going on with college campuses. Eventually, 900 college campuses we closed down. 35,000 National Guardsmen were mobilized. 21 campuses were occupied. Henry Kissinger, who was a special advisor at that point to Nixon, said, the crisis left Nixon on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Nixon decides he wants to see what happened, and he calls the governor of Pennsylvania, William Scranton, and he says to Scranton, get a commission together, find out what happened on the college campuses, find out why we had rioting. This is the second commission in 3 years that the White House has pulled together because of what's going on the streets. In 1967, Lyndon Johnson put together the Kernan Commission, named after the Illinois governor, Otto Kernan, who was a Democrat, Scranton's a Republican, to find out why there were race riots. Now Nixon wants to know why there's unrest on campuses. So that happens on June 13th, 1970. It would be the President's Commission on-campus unrest, also known as the Scranton Commission, and they have one charge: study the dissent, disorder, and violence breaking out on campuses around the nation. The commission issued its findings in September 1970 and concluded that the Ohio National Guard shootings on May 4th, 1970, unjustified. Meanwhile, Vietnam is still going and going and going, and there is a decorated war hero from World War II, Robert Dole, who is the junior senator at that time from Kansas, just elected to the Senate. And Robert Dole, of all people, starts pushing for the repeal of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. He offers an amendment on June 24th, 1970 to the Foreign Military Sales Act. Senate votes 81 to 10 to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and take the power of war out of Richard Nixon's hands. It didn't stick, though. On July 10th, 1970, the Senate again, roll call vote 57-5, passed a concurrent resolution repealing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. That's the second vote in 3 weeks to repeal the 1964 measure. Never happened before. October 12th, Vietnam War, Nixon announces that 40,000 troops would come home before Christmas. The week of November 10th, for the first time in 5 years, an entire week ends with no reports of United States combat fatalities in Southeast Asia. First time since 1965. More mundane things, Paul is quitting the Beatles. The Beatles were the 1960s. Some of you probably, like me, saw Ed Sullivan on stage. Here they are, the Beatles. But McCartney decides he's quitting the Beatles. Of course, John Lennon quit the Beatles in September of 1969. Keep that in your memory. Keep that in your memory because it comes back at the end of the year. The Beatles' official breakup was in April of 1970 when McCartney said that he was leaving the band. Let It Be would come out a month later. That was scheduled to all come out this year. The Let It Be album and the reissue of the Let It Be movie, along with a new Let It Be movie, but that's been pushed back to 2021 because of the COVID-19 outbreak. Disney pulled a lot of movies. Disney is putting out the movies, these particular movies. The space program. The space program in April of 1970, Apollo 13 is headed to the moon. Now the Senate decided, because they have the power of the pocketbook, they were cutting back on the space program. Partially because 1969, the TV ratings on Apollo 12 did not equal the TV ratings on Apollo 11. And also, since 1964, Congress was looking to cut back the space program, but John Kennedy was killed. Lyndon Johnson was the Senate Majority Leader for a long time, President of the United States, made sure the money was there so man could get to the moon by the end of the 1960s. Well, accomplished. 4 men walked on the moon, and it's time to cut back on the lunar missions, and Congress would cut back Apollo 18, 19, and 20, which would have gone in 1972, 73. Apollo 13, Jack Swigert, one of the astronauts. Okay, Houston, we had a problem here. After being prompted to repeat the transmission by Capcom Jack R. Lousma, Jim Lovell, Houston, we had a problem. Houston, we have a problem is what people thought it was, but it's Houston, we had a problem. And the problem was this: the service module, some of the engines blew up, and that caused big problems because they are nearing the moon, and this is the life support, all the oxygen and everything coming out of there. And there's Lovell on the left, Swaggart in the middle, and Fred Hayes on the right. I have a friend by the name of Dick Hull, H-O-L-L. He's now about 85, 86 years old. He worked for NASA between, say, 1960 and 1974, then ended up at the Goddard Space Center in Greenblatt, Maryland. And he worked this. And he told me about all the solutions that NASA tried to put together to get these guys home. These guys were in a dire situation. It was the third mission to the moon, landing. It carried Lovell, Swigert, and Hayes, launched on April 11th, 1970 at 2:13 in the afternoon. On April 13th, and that was Eastern Time, to 10:07 p.m. Eastern Time, the second oxygen tank explodes, and there are all kinds of problems with other oxygen tanks. After 3 hours, the oxygen is running out. The water is running out. Electricity is running out. And the steering system is all running out. The command module was dead. That basically was dead. The crew was about 200,000 miles away from Earth. That's Deke Slayton, who never got into space because of an ailment during the Mercury program, but he was the head of the astronauts. And he's showing what is supposedly tile that's being used to make sure carbon monoxide is not leaking into the lunar module, which is linked up with the command module, and that is the life support home, as Dick Hull said. Dick told me that there were about 30 solutions on the table, rated 1 through 30. What they picked, how to get home, was 30th and probably the riskiest, but they thought they could pull it off, and they weren't sure if they could pull off the other 29. The crew would spend 3.5 days in the lunar module. They rationed food, they rationed water. The designers, Grumman, which was Grumman the Grumman people in Bethpage, Long Island, Air and Space. They designed that lunar module for guys to stay in there no more than 2 or 3 days, but they had about 4 days before they had to come home. And so the 3 of them are packed into the lunar module. They start putting filters in, keeping carbon dioxide out, put on all kind of clothes because it's down to 38 degrees in the lunar module. And they are hoping that they could use all the burns, what's called burns, to make sure that they could swing back into an orbit that would get them back to Earth. And they did. It was 38 degrees inside. They shut off all kind of instruments. Conserving power was the big deal. They did get to the Earth trajectory. It was difficult to do, but they got the aircraft or the spacecraft back to Earth. Navigation and targeting functions unavailable, so they improvised. There was debris all over the place, so they couldn't navigate by the stars using, or they could use their stuff to navigate. So they used the sextant, old-fashioned way. They improvised using the horizon where the Earth meets the atmosphere as a reference point. They were able to have a fuel burn, and they eventually got back to Earth, all in one piece. Dick Hull once told me about the NASA, and I do some talks on the space program, and I'll give credit where credit's due. A lot of it comes from Dick. And in fact, Dick was the guy who straightened out the video from the moon, July 20th, 1969, came in upside down. He straightened it out. And he said that there were so many shortcuts that it was a miracle men got to the moon. It was a miracle that more astronauts weren't killed. And it was a miracle that these guys were able to come back. He said nothing else could explain it. The crew would splash down April 17th of 1970 near Samoa. And of course, there they are. After they got back from space, Fred Hayes on the left, Lovell in the middle, and Swigert on the right. It became a movie made by Opie, Ron Howard. And Tom Hanks was Jim Lovell. Now, I know a guy who told me he was friendly with Jim Lovell, and they went on the press tour where they were selling the movie, and Lovell went on some of those, on some of the junket. And when he got back, he asked Jim Lovell, he said, well, what'd you think? He said, it was great. He said, what was the toughest question you had? He said, they asked me whether Tom Hanks was a nice guy or not. Lovell said, he's a great guy. Lovell played a role in that movie. He's an older astronaut talking to young Jim Lovell, played by Tom Hanks. Oh, there he is again, Richard Nixon with King Hussein of Jordan. And King Hussein of Jordan, let me tell you, get off the beaten track here for a little bit and tell you about a guy I know by the name of Robert Friedman, who joined the Air Force in 1965 and was an advisor to Israeli prime ministers and met regularly with people like King Hussein and Yasser Arafat and others in the Middle East. He has books out there. Maybe the library does have books. You might have it, Maureen. His last name is spelled Friedman, F-R-E-E-D-M-A-N. He is a professor at Johns Hopkins University now. And anyway, getting off the beaten path here, he was telling me about meeting King Hussein for the first time. And he's in King Hussein's office. The secretary or whoever was there told him to wait with his wife inside. King will be there shortly. Or shortly was a couple hours. But Bob Friedman is looking around in the office and he sees 13 pictures. And the 13 pictures are all of King Hussein's relatives, all of whom died unnaturally, and including his father, who was assassinated because they were originally from Iraq and they were put into Jordan. And he said that he often wondered, never asked me, he said he often wondered what King Hussein thought sitting in that chair in that office with his 13 relatives, all of whom died unnaturally by a gun. He might have gotten his answer in 1970 if he would have pushed a little bit, because on September 1st, 1970, there was an assassination attempt against King Hussein of Jordan. And that precipitates the Black September crisis. Now, you probably know of Black September from the 1972 Munich Olympics, but they were operating long before the Munich Olympics. On September 15th, King Hussein forms a military government with Mohammed Daoud, prime minister. September 17th, Black September, King Hussein of Jordan orders the Jordanian armed forces to oust the Palestinian Fedayeen from Jordan because they were living the lawless life. Black September was a conflict fought in Jordan between the Jordanian Air Force and the Palestinian Liberation Organization under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, who took over in February of 1969. And that lasts 11 days, September 16th through the 27th. And there would be certain actions continuing until July 17th, 1971. And there is Yasser Arafat, who claimed he had nothing to do with what happened in Jordan. The Fedayeen was acting as a state within the state, Palestinian Liberation Organization. They disregarded local laws and regulations, tried to kill King Hussein twice, which probably prompted Bob Friedman to think about, well, what does he think about the 13 pictures around him? And that led to violent confrontations between the Fedayeen and the Jordanian army in June of 1970, and Hussein's fed up. The PLO actions in Jordan culminated in the Dawson Field hijackings on September 6th, where the Fedayeen hijacked 3 civilian aircraft, forced their landing in Zaka, and they took foreign nationals as hostages. They would blow up the planes and then let the hostages go, and that happened in front of international press. And there is Assad from Syria. He took over in Syria in 1969. Of course, his son is running Syria today. On September 17th, the Jordanian army surrounded cities with the PLO presence, shelling the Fedayeen, who had been establishing themselves in Palestinian refugee camps. On September 18th, the Syrian force with Palestinian Liberation Army markings intervened in support of the Fedayeen. There was an advancement toward Idlib. The Fedayeen declared it a liberated city inside of Jordan. But 5 days later, the Syrians withdrew after the Jordanian army launched an air and ground offensive. Syrians suffered heavy losses. The Arab countries decided to get involved, and they came down hard on King Hussein, tell him stop fighting. On October 13th, he signs an agreement with Arafat, and they're going to regulate the Fedayeen's presence in Jordan. And there's the day that Arafat and Hussein signed their peace treaty or truce. But that doesn't last very long. The Jordanian army again attacks in June of 71. Fedayeen are driven out of cities one by one. 2,000 Fedayeen would surrender in a forest July 17th, 1971. The Jordanians allowed the Fedayeen to leave for Lebanon through Syria. And of course, these conflicts go on and on and on, this being 49 and 50 years ago. And there's Nasser, Gamal Nasser, who's the president of Egypt, and there's Anwar Sadat, the vice president. On September 28th, 1970, Nasser dies. Sadat is named the temporary president of Egypt. About 10 days later, or 15 days later, they have a referendum for a new president. Sadat would get 90.04% of the vote, and he would become the president of Egypt. And he knew one thing: he would eventually have to have some sort of truce with Israel because it was costing a lot of money to keep the Egyptian army going, always on alert against Israel. Charles de Gaulle in 1967 inflamed Canada. He was speaking in Montreal, a hotel balcony, and he's in Montreal in 1967 to go see Expo 67 Montreal. And he's speaking to the Quebecois about long live free Quebec. And he gives that talk, he gives an international voice to the Quebec sovereignty movement. And that causes a diplomatic incident. And Lester Pearson, there's an airport named after Lester Pearson in Toronto that I know quite well, maybe too well, because you got to go through double security up there in Toronto. Anyway, Pearson criticized the speech, saying de Gaulle's statements were unacceptable to the Canadian people. Charles de Gaulle never did get to Expo 67 Montreal. But there were problems in 1970 with the group that was trying to get Quebec out of the Federation in Canada and try to form an independent country. It was called the Front de Libération de Québec. And they kidnapped in 1970 the deputy premier, Pierre Laporte, and a British diplomat, James Cross. Pierre Trudeau, the prime minister, invoked the only time in peacetime, the War Measures Act. The kidnappers murdered Laporte, and there were negotiations which got Cross released, and the kidnappers were exiled to Cuba. From 63 to 70, the Front de Libération de Québec detonated 95 bombs, most of them mailboxes. The biggest one in 1969 was the bombing of the Montreal Stock Exchange, injured 27 people, causing extensive damage. By 1970, Trudeau was able to put down the FLQ. There was dynamite missing from the military, industrial sites, financing for the FLQ, bank robberies, but 23 were imprisoned by 1970, 4 convicted of murder, and Trudeau was able to crush the movement in October 1970. Diplomatically and politically, Quebec's sovereignty leaders went the other way and would eventually try to declare independence through referendums, and they lost the referendums. What you got in Quebec is a distinct society now where French is the majority language. As you can see, stop arrête, except in federal buildings where it's arrête and stop. That's Quebec City. The crisis galvanized support against the use of violence in the effort to gain the sovereignty by the Quebecois, and they decided to go to the ballot box to see if they could get greater autonomy and independence. They have gotten some autonomy, but not independence. Meanwhile, Northern Ireland, the troubles continue. In Northern Ireland, the Catholics watched what Martin Luther King was doing with his nonviolent resistance in the civil rights movement in 1969. That would break out in Northern Ireland. There would be a skirmish, and the British would send troops to Northern Ireland, to support the Catholics, support the local government, and that was only supposed to last a couple of weeks. It lasted until 1998. Northern Ireland conflict from 70 to 72, there was an explosion of political violence. The conflict began in 1969 during a campaign to end discrimination against the Catholic nationalist minority by the Protestant Unionist government of Ireland and the Northern Ireland and police force. Where were you on August 26, 1970? Maybe some of you were part of the Women's March. Free abortion on demand, equal opportunities in jobs and education, free 24-hour child care centers. The march would start at 5:30, corner of 59th Street and 5th Avenue, right across from FAO Schwartz, if you remember that. And they'd walk down 5th Avenue and they'd have the rally at Bryant Park at 7:30. Organized by people like Betty Friedan, who organized the National Organization of Women back in 1966. The Women's Strike for Equality was a strike that took place on August 26th. It celebrated the 50th anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment. The 100th anniversary will be, of course, in a couple of weeks. The 19th Amendment, which effectively gave most American women the right to vote. If you're Chinese American, you didn't get the right to vote until a few years later. New York was one of the earliest states to have women voting, but this was in time for the 1920 presidential election. And there is Betty Friedan, one of the leaders of the group. She had 3 goals: free abortion on demand, equal opportunity in the workforce, and free child health care. Whether or not that was achieved is up to you. There were some things that happened in 1972, Title IX, which allowed women to get equal access to higher education to men, and Roe versus Wade in 1973. This is the Miss World contest in 1970 in London, and that was hosted by Bob Hope at the Royal Albert Hall, and it's disrupted by a women's liberation protest. 50 women hurled smoke bombs, stink bombs, and ink bombs into the crowd and at the stage. This is a continuation of what happened in 1968 in Atlantic City during the Miss America contest. And that, if you remember, is where people burned their bras. And sometimes I will ask women of a certain age who might have been there if they burnt their bras or not. One woman in Teaneck said to me, "Are you crazy for asking that question? You must be crazy because, well, you're a guy, you wouldn't know. First of all, they were too expensive. Secondly, do you know how difficult it is to find a bra that fits? You wouldn't know you're a guy." Some other woman said, "No, she's right." And I do ask that question, and I get all kinds of answers. And basically, it's, hey, why would we do that? It's too expensive. And finding a comfortable bra. But in 1968, one of the tenets of the women's liberation movement was to get rid of all manifestations that encumbered you, which included a bra or wearing a girdle. And there was a big demonstration on the boardwalk in Atlantic City with a big garbage can of women dumping bras in there and then setting them on fire. And so the women's protest was aimed at beauty pageants, because they thought that beauty pageants really didn't show off women's talents, that they were actually degrading in a lot of ways. That is William Safire. William Safire put words in the mouth of Spiro Agnew. In fact, Safire was anti-media, at least through Agnew, and yet he would end up on the editorial board of the New York Times, something as a journalist I could never understand because he was so anti-media. Agnew on the warpath. And he talked about the media, both in 1969 and 1970, and the most famous of the anti-media talks is in San Diego on September 11th. Dateline, San Diego, September 11th, 1970. In the United States today, we have more than our share of nattering nabobs of negativism. Agnew criticized his opponents and the press. The words written by William Safire, who went on as a media member, a New York Times columnist, and he did that every Sunday in the New York Times magazine section, the words thing. In 1969, Safire wrote the words. It wasn't Pat Buchanan, who was the other speechwriter. It was Safire, who talked about how the enemy was TV network news, Walter Cronkite, Howard K. Smith, and Huntley and Brinkley. That was Agnew in 1969. The last of the big rock shows was in England in 1970, the Isle of Wight. And 600,000 people attended the largest rock festival of all time. It was really the last time you saw Jimi Hendrix, The Who, The Doors. Maybe one last time you saw The Doors, because Jim Morrison would die in 1971. Chicago, Richie Havens. Richie Havens, who I went to a party with, had the longest fingernails I ever saw on a man. I said, why so long? He said, because I plucked my guitar. John Sebastian, Joan Baez, who was on her retirement tour last year. 10 years after, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, the Moody Blues, and Jethro Tull. That is the last huge, huge, huge rock festival, Monterey Pop, Woodstock, and this. Janis Joplin would die from a heroin overdose in 1970. Jimi Hendrix would choke on drug-induced vomiting, and Jim Morrison would die in 1971. Sesame Street started in November of 1969, but there were still some people who were upset with Sesame Street. Didn't particularly like Sesame Street. They were in Mississippi. And there were some local elected officials that wanted to kick Sesame Street off local Mississippi TV, which would have been kind of impossible because if you know anything about the Mississippi markets in the South, which is Gulfport going down to Biloxi, it's a New Orleans TV station. Okay, there is Jackson, but you go to the northeast part of Mississippi, it's the Memphis stations. And you go down to the south, you got Biloxi, but you also have stations that come in from Mobile, Alabama. They all have PBS stations. So even though some people in Mississippi voted to get rid of Sesame Street, they could probably only do it in the capital of Jackson if they went that far. A state commission in Mississippi voted to ban Sesame Street because of its highly integrated cast of children. I don't know how many of you ever been to McSorley's, the tavern in Manhattan. Sawdust all over the place. It smelled like it was an alehouse, but women's led. Women wanted to get into McSorley's, which was the oldest alehouse, an Irish tavern in New York City, formed in 1854. No women could step inside. That was until 1970 when Betty Friedan and the National Organization of Women sued them for discrimination. They decided, you know what, we'll let the women in, forget the lawsuit, and they let women in. The Chicago Seven, 1970, 5 of them get acquitted of conspiracy and convicted of inciting a riot, sentenced to 5 years in prison each, given $5,000 fines. And that would all be overturned in later on, 1971, by an appellate court. Howard Cosell and Monday Night Football. There is Howard on the left. Keith Jackson, who once told me he saved his life by being kicked off of Monday Night Football in 1970. And Dandy Don Meredith. Now, Howard and I had an acquaintanceship. Howard, 2 of his grandsons, Justin and Colin. Colin is the PA announcer for the New York Mets. We're friendly. And Howard once told me, I was about 28, 29 years old, what the hell are you doing in this cockamamie business? You're too smart to be in it. Anyway, Monday Night Football starts. Cleveland Browns hosting the New York Jets, September of 1970. Cosell was the first person hired by Rowan, get over here, Rowan Arledge, because he was Howard Cosell, bigger than life. Well, he would become bigger than life on Monday Night Football. Frank Gifford recommended that Don Meredith, the country slicker, who was a lot smarter than he sounded, would be the perfect foil for the New York-born Howard. Actually, he was born in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And one thing you might not know about Howard, Howard was 6'3". Towered over me. I'm 6 foot. He was 6'3". And there's Keith Jackson, who lasted a year. Gifford, who recommended to Arledge hiring Don Meredith, would replace Keith Jackson. Keith would go on to be a college football announcer and said he probably had his life spared because he didn't have to keep up with those 2. And there's Jim Bouton and me at the Yogi Berra Museum. We were on the same podium in 2007. Jim passed away last year. Jim Bouton wrote the best book ever in baseball, and it came out in June of 1970. It's called Ball 4, and I'm sure Somewhere in there, Maureen could probably find you Ball 4, my favorite baseball book, and Jim and I were acquaintances. He passed away last year in Great Barrington, Massachusetts at the age of 80. He was 80 years old last year. On June 19th, Ball 4 was published, and he's called into the baseball commissioner's office, has to talk to Bowie Kuhn, who doesn't know what to make of the book because Mickey Mantle drank. Players had feelings, and they didn't like being traded, and they had groupies and other things. And Bowie Kuhn wants Jim Bouton to sign an affidavit that everything in the book was made up. Bouton said none of it was made up. In fact, I've seen some of the stuff that didn't get into the book, which Bowie would have gone completely crazy with. Jim and I crossed paths a lot, but we were only on one panel together. That was at the Yogi Berra Museum in 2007. The book was rated by the New York Public Library as one of the 20 most influential nonfiction books of the 20th century. Rhodesia severs its last tie with the British Crown in 1970. It declares itself a racially segregated republic. Tonga and Fiji also say goodbye to Britain. Remember the days where the sun never set on the British Empire? Those days are over. And that is Allende from Chile. He becomes the first socialist ever to be elected as president of a country, actually a Marxist, Salvador Guillermo Allende Gossens. He was a physician, a social politician, and he would last there for 3 years. First ever Marxist to be elected the president of a democracy. Pope Paul VI was, well, there was an attempt on his life. That's November 27th. He's wounded in the chest during a visit to the Philippines by a dagger-wielding Bolivian painter who's disguised as a priest. He would recover and continue for quite a few years after that. And now we get to the end of the year. Elvis is in the building. Hi, Elvis. Elvis Presley meets Richard Nixon in the Oval Office, December 21st, 1970. Rather odd meeting. Nixon wasn't an Elvis guy. Elvis was the biggest thing, of course, in music in the 1950s, while Nixon was vice president. But Nixon wasn't that into Elvis. And I'm not sure if Trisha and Julie were into Elvis either. But anyway, Elvis concocts a plan. Wants to meet Nixon in the Oval Office. And Nixon is open to the plan, obviously. They meet on December 21st. Elvis wants to meet Nixon because basically, according to his wife Priscilla, he wants to get a badge, not a bag, a badge, from the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. Priscilla later wrote that Elvis thought that if he had a badge, he could legally enter any country wearing guns and carrying drugs. Yeah, simple. Wasn't that simple, though, because the colonel, Tom Parker, his manager, was an illegal alien. Hence, Elvis never performed outside of the United States except for a bunch of concerts in Toronto in 1957. The problem was that the colonel, who was a 50-50 partner with Elvis, Elvis had no problems with that. Being a legal alien, even though he did serve in the U.S. Army, was afraid that they'd catch him as an illegal alien. And he would be deported back to Europe. So Elvis, he convinced Elvis, stay at home. Elvis did get to Hawaii. Of course, Elvis was in the Army in Germany. So Elvis, even though he wanted to go to other countries and perform, carrying drugs and a gun, never went to other countries because the colonel didn't want him to do that, because he went with the colonel. He went with Elvis all the time. So he dissuaded Elvis from ever performing outside of the United States, except for those 4 or 5 off concerts in Toronto. And there they are. There they are. Nixon and Elvis, and they're both having a grand old time in the Oval Office. Presley had written to Nixon, "I can and will do more good if I were made a federal agent at large, and I will help out by doing it my way." Nixon not sure was doing it my way. I don't think Elvis was doing the big my way thing in Las Vegas at that time. My Way, of course, written by Paul Anka. I will help out by doing it my way. Through my communications with people of all ages. Well, the problem with Elvis is most of his fans were accumulated, say, from 1956 till he went in the Army in 1958. And he certainly wasn't making any new fans with all those cheesy movies that he did, including the IRS song with Bill Bixby and Gail Gordon in one of his movies where he's a race car driver owing the IRS money. But he does come back in December 1968 with that Elvis Return special, sponsored by Singer Sewing Machine. So anyway, he doesn't really have new fans, but he thinks he does. First and foremost, I'm an entertainer, but all I need is the federal credentials. He concluded by saying he would love to meet the president. Obviously, he would meet the president. His main target were these guys: John Lennon, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, and Ringo Starr. This is the last publicity shoot that the Beatles did in August of 1969. September of 69, Lennon is out of the group. Somebody forgot to tell Elvis about that. The two men got along rather well during the meeting. Elvis got his badge. During the meeting, Elvis said he felt that the Beatles exemplified an anti-American nature. They came from Liverpool. They were English. The other thing, the Beatles broke up in September of 1969. 10 days after Elvis and Dick Nixon met at the White House, Paul McCartney sued the other three Beatles and Alan Klein to dissolve the Beatles partnership. Elvis was a little off. That was the year that was, 1970. 1971, Nixon would install his recording system, and Daniel Ellsberg would put out the Pentagon Papers. Thank you so much. Thank you, Maureen, for inviting me. Oh, and yes, look at that picture. Remember I told you about me and John Lindsay with the hair and all that? That is my Secret Service credential from 1980 when I was on the campaign trail with Ronald Reagan and Ted Kennedy and covered the New York State Senate race, which ultimately was Al D'Amato against Elizabeth Holtzman with Jacob Javits, who was suffering from ALS at the time, who couldn't campaign on the liberal line. Anyway, Maureen, thank you. Any questions? Any
thank you so much. Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. If anybody does have any questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A.
Oh, no, you can open up. You can open up or I'll open up. They can just ask questions directly.
I don't know if I can because we've got everyone muted. This is the webinar platform. So it's
okay. Well,
to type in.
All right. Okay. So if they type in.
So, yeah, if they type in, we'll see it.
Yeah. Okay. That's. Well, let me. While I'm waiting here, let me do my romper room thing, and we'll thank everybody who came. It looks like Ellen. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Ann. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Doris. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Irene.
Romper room.
Yeah, romper, stomper, bumper, boot. Tell me who. And thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Lisa, Marilyn, Mary Jane, Mayra. Hope I got that right. Miriam, Noreen, Pete and Carol, Robert Glassman, Sue Zicker, Susan. Thank you all for coming. Any questions or any comments?
I don't see any questions right now. So, Evan, you must have covered everything so well.
Thank you. Well, thank everybody for coming, and thank you, Maureen, for inviting me.
I thank you so much for being with us. Everyone at home, thank you for joining us. We'll see you again at another BTL Library virtual event. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye, Evan. Thanks.
Bye-bye.